So in this lesson, we're going to look at specifically slope-intercept form. So remember, an equation of a line is a relationship that shows the relationship between two variables, specifically an input and an output. Normally, in algebraic equations for lines, we use x for our input variable and y for our output. Remember, the input variable is also like the independent variable, and so x is our independent variable usually, and y is our dependent variable. It's two formats that we use. So we have that we normally are going to see. One is standard form and one is slope-intercept form. They're used for different things, but the one we're going to be focusing on is this one, slope-intercept form. So you need to make sure that you know what each of them look like. So one of the things to know about standard form is that the two variables are on the same side of the equation in standard form. But also in slope-intercept form, the y variable is by itself. In standard form, the a, b, and c are always going to be, or normally going to be, integers. So an example would be an equation, 3x plus 2y equals 8, or something like x minus 5y equals 10. In slope-intercept form, M represents slope, and B represents the slope, the y-intercept. And we'll talk about that more specifically in a moment. Okay, so what is slope-intercept form telling you when you look at it? So it's telling you the two specific values. One is that the coefficient of the x variable, or the independent variable if we're not using x and y, is the actual slope of the line. The b, the number that we're adding or subtracting from the x term, is what we call the y-intercept of a line. And if you don't know what the y-intercept is, well, the y-intercept is going to be defined as this, okay? It's the point that the line crosses the y-axis. Its coordinates are always going to have its x value as 0, and then the y value is going to be at whatever value is crossing the y-axis. So it can be an integer, but it also could be like 1/2, -1/3, -0.7, things like that. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at the relationship between the equation in slope-intercept form and what we see on the graph. So if I had no idea how to use slope-intercept form to do a graph, I could start off with a table of values. So I might go ahead and pick numbers like -1, 0, and 1 for my inputs and just go ahead and do the math, replacing the x with the number from my table and then doing the math. So if I go ahead and replace it with -1, I get 3 times -1 is -3. -3 take away 2 is -5. Then I would go ahead and go to my coordinate plane, and I would go ahead and go to -1, -5, and put my point down. So now I would go ahead and repeat those steps for 0. 3 times 0 is 0. -2 would be -2. So I have a point at 0, -2. And then again, repeat it for the next number on my list, 1. So I go ahead and do 3 times 1 is 3. 3 take away 2 is 1. And when I graph it, I have 1, 1. So now when I go ahead and draw my line, I see that I have this is my line. So I know that the slope-intercept form is supposed to tell me the slope and the y-intercept. So let's go ahead and look at them. So I see that here is where the line is crossing the y-axis. So what are the coordinates of that? Well, if I actually go ahead and I look at the coordinates of it, I see that the x value is equal there to 0 because it's right there in the middle of the x-axis. And my y value is -2. And when I go ahead and I actually look over here at my equation, I see that connection. I see that that -2 is what I have here that I'm adding to the term 3x, because 3x plus -2 is the same as 3x minus 2. So this number by itself tells me exactly where on the x-axis that point is going to go. That's called my y-intercept. Okay, now let's look at the slope. So remember, it doesn't matter which 2 points we use to calculate the slope when I'm using a graph. So I just want to go ahead and figure out my rise and run. So I know that if I'm going from this point to this point, I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is positive because going up is a positive direction. Then I'm going to go right 2, which is also a positive direction. So my slope is +6 over +2, rise over run. 6 divided by 2 simplifies to 3. And again, where do I see that number in my equation? I see 3 right there in front of that coefficient of x. So when the equation's written in slope-intercept form, I can directly look at this equation and interpret the slope is this number. It's the number that's the coefficient of x. I can go ahead and then look at what I'm adding or subtracting from the x term, and I can see that that is going to be my y-intercept. So let's go ahead and practice and make sure we can understand how to pull that out of our equation. Okay, so here's 3 equations. Y equals 7/8 times x plus 1, y equals -5 times x minus 8, and y equals -10x. And your job is to figure out what is the slope and what is the y-intercept of each one. Okay, so what you should do is go ahead and pause the video and see what you get. Okay, so let's see how we did. So we know that y equals mx plus b is slope-intercept form. And we know that the number that's the coefficient of x is my slope, and the number that I'm adding or subtracting from the x term is going to be my y-intercept. So let's go ahead and look. What's the coefficient of x in this one? 7/8. What's the coefficient of x in the second one? -5. What's the coefficient of x in the third one? -10. So those have to be my slopes. So this line has a slope of 7/8. This line has a slope of -5. And this line has a slope of -10. And then the number that I'm adding or subtracting from the x term has to be my y-intercept. So here I'm adding 1, subtracting 8. Now the third one we'll get back to in a second, but let's write this down. So here, 1 is our y-intercept. -8 is our y-intercept in the second one. But over here, what's the only number in this third one that I can add to -10 times x that keeps it -10 times x? Well, 0. So even though I don't see a number that I'm adding or subtracting, remember you can always add 0 and not change the value of an expression. So that means I'm adding 0 and my y-intercept has to be 0. Okay, so next, after this lesson, we're going to be learning how to use slope-intercept form to actually come up with a graph without having to do a table of values. It's called a quick graph.